First, through Russia's strategy in regard to Aleppo.
Well, you're absolutely right about Russia's role from the very beginning. They've provided at first diplomatic, then military, now again diplomatic cover to Assad. In Aleppo, the Russian position has been to effectively allow this ceasefire to backslide, the upsurge in fighting there with Syrian army and associated units, both fighting in the city and also aerial bombardments from above. That's something that slipped through this rather tricky and imprecise language of the ceasefire deal agreed earlier this spring, which allowed for all sorts of exemptions for different categories of different kinds of fighters that no one can seem to agree on. And with the Russians effectively refusing to push Assad to cease bombarding and to cease bombing Aleppo, that's essentially been the same thing as a green light for Syrian forces to continue to attack the city. So really it's a question of both what Russia is willing to do in terms of leverage and also what Russia actually can do in terms of leverage. In other words, if the Russians were to tell Assad that's enough, withhold fire in Aleppo, stop fighting, is that something even that Assad would heed to, would listen to? And I think that's going to be a big question in the days going forward.
Joshua, just to be clear, of course, Russia not at these talks on now in Geneva over the next few days, but the Syrian army has confirmed an earlier announcement from Russia that a so-called regime of calm around Damascus has now been extended for another 48 hours. What does that mean exactly?
It's a good question about exactly what that terminology means as opposed to a ceasefire. It's something probably less than a full ceasefire. It's both the less complicated, less moving parts diplomatically and negotiating-wise to pull together than a ceasefire. But interesting that announcement came from Lieutenant General Sergei Korolenko in charge of Russian military operations in Syria at the Latakia air base, which really does show, even if not always officially, how large and present the Russian role is in terms of the behind-the-scenes political and diplomatic negotiations. Clearly, the Russian role in this is quite large, that we saw this announcement coming out of the Russian base in Latakia, that the Russians seem to think they were able to convince the Syrians, to convince the Assad regime to extend this so-called regime of silence, regime of calm, a kind of soft quasi-ceasefire to Aleppo. But again, like many ceasefires throughout this long and bloody war, the question of how it will be implemented and how long it will hold is really an open question and one of some doubt.